The year is 1451. The world is a place defined by trade, faith, and the seemingly impenetrable barrier of the great Western Ocean. In the bustling port city of Genoa, Italy, a boy is born, a boy whose restless spirit would ultimately change the map of the world forever, Cristoforo Colombo, or as history remembers him, Christopher Columbus. For centuries, Europe had looked east. Exotic spices, silks, and precious gems flowed along the legendary Silk Road from Asia. But by the mid-15th century, the landscape of global trade was fracturing. The rise of the Ottoman Empire had choked the ancient overland routes, making the journey treacherous and vastly increasing the prices set by Venetian and Genoese middlemen. Europe was hungry. Hungry for gold, hungry for God, and most of all, hungry for a new route to the Orient. The prize was immense, direct access to the wealth of the Indies. Columbus's early life was one of wool carding, not nobility. His father was a weaver. But the sea air of Genoa was a powerful influence. He quickly traded the loom for the deck. By his early 20s, he was sailing the treacherous Mediterranean, navigating along the coasts of Italy, Portugal, and even exploring the Greek islands. In 1476, his life took a pivotal turn. While sailing in a convoy to England, his ship was attacked by French privateers off the coast of Portugal. The vessel sank. Columbus, wounded, was forced to swim several miles to the Portuguese shore near Lagos. This dramatic event was, ironically, his greatest stroke of luck. Portugal was the undisputed epicenter of maritime exploration. Under the legacy of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese mariners were systematically pushing down the coast of Africa, pioneering the use of the caravel, a sleek, fast vessel perfect for long voyages. Columbus settled in Lisbon. Here, he began to marry his practical experience with rigorous self-education. He read the great geographers, Ptolemy, whose work dated from antiquity, and the more contemporary writings of Pierre d'Ailly. He studied maps, charts, and astronomical tables. He devoured the famous travelogue of Marco Polo, which painted a dazzling picture of Cathay, China, and Cipangu, Japan. Columbus became convinced of a radical idea: the world was a sphere, and therefore, one could reach the east by sailing west. This was not a unique theory. Educated men had known the world was round for centuries. Columbus's crucial, life-defining error was a simple matter of size. He heavily relied on sources that drastically underestimated the circumference of the Earth. Ptolemy's geography miscalculated the size of the Eurasian landmass, suggesting it stretched much further east than it actually did. Furthermore, his misinterpretation of the work of the astronomer Alfraganus led him to calculate the distance to Asia across the Atlantic as approximately 2,400 nautical miles. Columbus believed that the vast ocean separating Europe from Japan was narrow enough for a westward journey. He imagined a short, navigable sail to the legendary islands of the East. This crucial mathematical flaw was the very premise upon which his entire dream, and eventually, the discovery of the Americas, was built. To realize his dream, Columbus needed three things: ships, supplies, and, most importantly, royal patronage. A voyage of this magnitude was too expensive, too risky, and too revolutionary for any private investor. His quest for a sponsor began in Portugal, the nation best equipped for the task. He presented his plan to King John II. The Portuguese crown, however, had the best navigational minds in Europe. They quickly convened a royal committee of experts. These experts, unlike Columbus, possessed more accurate calculations for the Earth's circumference. They listened, they checked the math, and they unanimously rejected the proposal, concluding that the voyage was impossibly long and the risk too great. Frustrated and now a widower with 2 young sons, Columbus left Portugal under a cloud of debt. He traveled to Castile, the rising power of the Iberian Peninsula, and sought an audience with Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. For 6 long, grueling years, Columbus followed the Spanish court, a persistent, sometimes arrogant petitioner. He was given a modest allowance but was repeatedly delayed. The Spanish monarchs were preoccupied with the Reconquista, the centuries-long war to expel the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. The crown's coffers were empty, and its focus was entirely on the siege of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. Year after year, the Royal Commission found Columbus's claims exaggerated and his cost excessive. They argued that his estimates of the distance were far too low. To the Spanish court, Columbus was a dreamer, an obsessed foreigner whose demands were often seen as outrageous. Finally, in January 1492, the city of Granada fell. The Reconquista was complete. Spain was united, triumphant, and now, finally, its monarchs could turn their attention to external ambitions. Columbus was immediately summoned to the court, but his final meeting nearly ended in yet another failure. His demands were astonishing. He wanted the noble title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He demanded the title of Viceroy and Governor of any lands he might discover. He insisted on 10% of all wealth, pearls, gold, silver, spices, gained from the new lands, in perpetuity. The court balked. The terms were unprecedented for a man of his standing. Columbus, arrogant and supremely confident in his destiny, refused to compromise and rode away from the court, prepared to try his luck with the King of France. But his dramatic exit had an unexpected effect. 2 crucial figures intervened, Luis de Santangel, the king's finance minister, and Juan Perez, a prior who had befriended Columbus. They urgently pleaded with Isabella. They argued that the cost was negligible compared to the potential gain, and that failure to act might allow a rival kingdom, like France, to reap the rewards. Isabella was swayed. The money was quickly secured, and a messenger was dispatched to catch the departing, defiant Columbus. On April 17, 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. Christopher Columbus was granted everything he had asked for. The long, frustrating dream was finally a reality. He had the titles, the money, and the ships. The door to the west was open. The stage was set. In the next part, we will follow Columbus and his crew as they prepare for the impossible journey, and finally, sail off the edge of the known world. Sailing the edge of the world. With the capitulations of Santa Fe signed, Columbus had his royal commission, but he faced a new, immense challenge, turning a piece of paper into a fleet capable of crossing an ocean. The terms of the contract were sealed in April 1492. Columbus was given 3 months to prepare. The staging ground was the small, relatively obscure port of Palos de la Frontera in Andalusia. Palos was chosen because its mariners owed a debt to the crown. They were required to supply 2 fully equipped caravels for a period of 12 months. But sailors, hearing the fantastic and terrifying rumors of the voyage, were less than enthusiastic. This was not a quick trip to the Canaries. This was a reckless venture into the fabled Sea of Darkness, where monsters were said to roam and the very wind might cease to blow, trapping ships forever. Recruitment was initially difficult. Columbus, the arrogant Genoese foreigner, was largely disliked. It was here that the local expertise of a single family proved indispensable, the Pinzon brothers. Martín Alonso Pinzon, a wealthy and highly respected local shipowner and master mariner, and his brothers, Vicente Yanez Pinzon and Francisco Martín Pinzon, threw their considerable reputation and influence behind the project. Their support was the crucial turning point, drawing the necessary crew from Palos and the neighboring town of Huelva. Columbus's tiny fleet was assembled. The Santa Maria, the largest ship and the flagship. It was a Nao, or carrack, a heavier, slower, three-masted vessel, likely hired from the Galician coast. Columbus captained her. The Pinta, a smaller, faster caravel, captained by Martín Alonso Pinzon. The Nina, the smallest and most agile caravel, captained by Vicente Yanez Pinzon. The name Nina was a nickname, likely after her owner, Juan Nino. The total crew numbered around 90 men. It was a collection of professionals, master mariners, pilots, and boatswains, alongside common seamen, servants, and an official interpreter, Luis de Torres, included because he reportedly knew Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, languages Columbus believed would be useful for communicating with Asian rulers. Remarkably, the fleet was entirely provisioned for no more than 12 months of sailing. They carried salted meats, hard biscuits, hardtack, wine, and fresh water stored in barrels, supplies that would quickly become rancid or scarce. The departure and the Canary interlude. The final preparations were completed under intense pressure. At dawn, Friday, August 3, 1492, the three small ships, loaded with human hope and the weight of European ambition, slipped anchor from Palos. The first leg of the journey, the trip to the Canary Islands, was relatively standard. They were sailing through known waters, following well-established trade routes. This leg took about 9 days. However, the voyage was marred by an early mechanical failure. The rudder of the Pinta broke. Columbus suspected sabotage by the ship's owners, who were deeply reluctant about the journey, but he could not afford a delay. They made a crucial stop at the Canary Islands, the outermost point of European civilization. Over the next 4 weeks, the Pinta was repaired, and the Nina was re-rigged. The Nina was originally a lateen-rigged caravel, using triangular sails that were excellent for maneuvering in the Mediterranean but inefficient for open ocean sailing. In the Canaries, she was converted to the more robust and faster square-rigged sails, essential for catching the powerful, steady winds of the Atlantic. Columbus also took on fresh water, wood, and provisions. Most importantly, he waited for the right celestial conditions and the correct wind pattern. The Canaries were ideally positioned to catch the trade winds, a steady atmospheric current that blows reliably to the west. On September 6, 1492, with the ships fully repaired and provisioned, they left the volcanic shores of La Gomera, sailing past the great peak of Teide on Tenerife. This was the true beginning of the voyage, the moment they sailed into the uncharted territory of the vast, unknown ocean. The longitude of fear. For the next 33 days, the ships were alone. Day after day, the sun rose over an endless horizon, and the setting sun was followed by nothing but darkness and waves. This leg of the voyage was a masterpiece of endurance and navigation, but it was also a psychological trial of the highest order. Columbus maintained a remarkably constant and fast pace, averaging about 150 miles a day. He was an expert at utilizing the trade winds. But as the days turned into weeks, the crew grew increasingly anxious. Columbus employed a sophisticated deception to maintain morale. He kept two sets of records. A secret, accurate log. This log recorded the true, frightening distance they had traveled away from Spain. A public, shorter log. This log was shared with the crew and deliberately underestimated the daily distance. His logic was simple: the men would be less terrified if they believed they were still relatively close to the familiar safety of Europe. Despite his attempts to keep order, fear manifested in various ways. The compass crisis, September 13. The crew noticed something disturbing. The ship's compass no longer pointed exactly to the pole star, true north. Instead, it showed a subtle shift in the magnetic north. This phenomenon, known as magnetic declination, was utterly terrifying to the uneducated sailor. They believed the basic laws of nature were breaking down and that their instrument of survival was failing. Columbus successfully bluffed his way through this crisis, suggesting the pole star itself was moving, not the needle. The Sargasso Sea, late September. The ships sailed into a vast region of the Atlantic carpeted with thick, dense seaweed. The Sargasso Sea is a natural feature, but to the crew, this was a living nightmare. They feared the vegetation was a sign of a shallow, landlocked area or that it would trap the vessels forever, making progress impossible. The lack of land and the monotonous routine led to increasing unrest. The captains, especially Martín Alonso Pinzón, were the only men truly loyal to Columbus. On several occasions, as the journey stretched past the 3-week mark where conventional wisdom dictated they should have reached land, the crew came close to mutiny. They urged Columbus to turn back before the provisions ran low and the ships faced the nearly impossible task of sailing against the trade winds. Columbus, a man of profound faith and stubborn conviction, refused, buying time with promises of wealth and threats of punishment. False alarms and rising tension. As the psychological pressure peaked, the signs of land became the focus of intense obsession. September 25, Martín Alonso Pinzón, aboard the Pinta, was so convinced he saw land that he yelled the promised reward for first sight. Columbus and the crew of the Santa Maria knelt in prayer. The euphoria lasted 3 days until they realized it was nothing more than a bank of low-lying clouds on the horizon. October 1st to 6th, small, encouraging signs appeared. Birds, such as petrels and boobies, began to be seen frequently, suggesting a proximity to land, though they were not conclusive. October 7th, the Nina flew a flag signaling land, but again, it was a false hope. The disappointment was crushing, and the internal struggle reached its climax. Columbus was now in a precarious position. The crew's patience was exhausted, and a full-scale revolt seemed imminent. He knew that if he continued much longer without success, the men would either force him to turn back or overthrow him. On October 7th, based on the Pinzón brothers' insistence, Columbus made a crucial decision. He ordered a radical change of course. For weeks, they had been sailing due west. Now, observing the direction of a greater variety of birds flying southwest, he decided to follow them, gambling everything on their biological instinct. He had calculated that Japan should be near, but the bird suggested an archipelago or islands to the south. This pivot to the southwest was the single most important navigational decision of the entire voyage. The moment of destiny. The next 5 days were the tensest of the entire journey. The air was thick with the weight of expectation and fear. If they did not find land soon, they would be forced to retreat, and Columbus's dream, and perhaps his life, would be forfeit. October 11th, the air became noticeably warmer and fresher. A piece of cane, freshly cut and still green, was spotted floating in the water. Then, a small plank of carved wood, a sign of human work. And finally, a thorny branch with fresh berries attached. These were undeniable signs. Land was not just near, it was imminent. Columbus ordered the ships to reduce sail and proceed with extreme caution through the night, lest they crash into an unexpected coast in the dark. A reward of an annuity of 10,000 maravedis was promised to the man who first sighted the shore. At 2 a.m. on Friday, October 12, 1492, a lookout aboard the Pinta, named Rodrigo de Triana, also known as Juan Rodriguez Bermejo, cried out the single, most consequential word in the history of the age of exploration. Land! Land! A small, low-lying island appeared in the moonlight, a shape that, for 36 days, had been a terrifying figment of hope. The endless ocean had yielded. The impossible was achieved. The crews of all 3 ships broke into prayers and tears. Columbus, now the triumphant admiral, would later claim the reward for himself, stating he had glimpsed a faint light hours earlier, but the cheers of the moment were for Rodrigo de Triana, the first man to see the end of the long night. The age of isolation was over. The journey had ended. The world was about to be remade. The first landing and the search for gold. The day is Friday, October 12, 1492. At sunrise, the 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, found a protected anchorage off a small island in what Columbus believed were the outermost fringes of the Asian archipelago. The island's native inhabitants called it Guanahani. Columbus, in an act of solemn piety, immediately renamed it San Salvador, Holy Savior. Columbus, dressed in scarlet robes and carrying the royal banner, stepped ashore, followed by the Pinzon brothers, carrying the banners of the expedition, green crosses adorned with the initial letters of Ferdinand and Isabella, crowned. They knelt, kissed the soil, and formally took possession of the land in the name of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. As they performed this ritual, they were watched by the island's residents, the Taino people. These were a peaceful, Arawak-speaking population, and their first encounter with the Europeans was marked by profound curiosity, not fear. Columbus described the Taino in his log as naked as the day they were born, innocent, and generous. He was immediately struck by their physical appearance, noting their handsome features and, crucially, their simplicity. They came with gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and small quantities of food. The Europeans offered glass beads, small bells, and red caps, trinkets that the Taino readily accepted, believing them to be of great value. This initial exchange was crucial, revealing Columbus's immediate priorities. He observed that the Taino wore small pieces of gold dangling from their noses. When asked where it came from, they repeatedly pointed to the south. Columbus instantly fixed his attention on this glimmering metal. The voyage was not just about geography, it was about commerce and conversion. He wrote in his journal, "I believe that they would easily be made Christians, for it appeared to me that they had no religion." He viewed them through the twin lenses of his mission, as souls to be saved and as a resource to be exploited. Island hopping, the pursuit of Cipangu. Columbus spent only 2 days at San Salvador. His goal was not this small, sandy island. His mind was fixed on the vast, wealthy civilizations described by Marco Polo. He was looking for the imperial courts of the Great Khan in Cathay and the fabled golden roofs of Cipangu, Japan. The Taino, through a mixture of sign language and misunderstanding, kept pointing to larger landmasses to the south and west. Over the next 2 weeks, the fleet sailed through the intricate network of the modern-day Bahamas, naming islands as they went: Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Fernandina, Isabella. Columbus meticulously recorded the beauty of the landscape, yet he was increasingly frustrated. These were charming, small islands, but they were not the great, sophisticated trading ports of Asia. He constantly asked for Colba and Bohio, misinterpreting the native names for Cuba and the island now known as Hispaniola. He believed Colba must be the mainland of Cathay or, perhaps, Cipangu itself. On October 28, 1492, the 3 ships made landfall on the northern coast of Cuba. Columbus was convinced he had finally reached the continent of Asia. The size of the island, the large rivers, and the reports of large inland settlements led him to believe he was near the city of Quinsay, the great trading center Marco Polo had described. He sent an official embassy inland, led by the interpreter Luis de Torres, to find the Great Khan. The embassy failed spectacularly. After traveling for days, they did not find silk-clad mandarins. Instead, they found small Taino villages and observed the natives inhaling smoke from rolled-up dried leaves, the first European encounter with tobacco. The desertion and the discovery of Hispaniola. The failure to find the Khan or gold in Cuba began to strain the cohesion of the small fleet. The Pinzon brothers, successful merchants and keen to get rich, grew impatient with Columbus's obsession with Asian empires and his confusing coastal reconnaissance. On November 21, 1492, a defining event of the first voyage occurred. Martin Alonso Pinzon, aboard the Pinta, abruptly deserted the fleet. He sailed east, separating from Columbus, driven by rumors of a land rich in gold, a place the Taino called Bohio or Babe Q. Pinzon's action was a clear act of insubordination, a pursuit of profit over the admiral's command, demonstrating the deep tension between Columbus's lofty, often incorrect, geographical theories and the practical, avaricious interests of his crew. Now with only 2 ships, Columbus continued east, finally arriving at the island the natives called Bohio, the land of the large rivers, on December 5, 1492. He renamed it La Isla Española, the Spanish island, which would become known as Hispaniola. This island, shared today by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, would prove to be the epicenter of the entire enterprise. Hispaniola was immediately different. The natives here were less shy, and the gold jewelry was more plentiful. Columbus soon made contact with a powerful Taino chief, or cacique, named Guacanagari, whose village was on the northwest coast. The hospitality shown by Guecanagari was immense, and the chief provided gifts of gold objects, further confirming Columbus's conviction that vast wealth was nearby. He was convinced this was the true Cipangu. Christmas tragedy, the wreck of the Santa Maria. The success and ease of finding gold were abruptly and tragically halted on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1492. Columbus, exhausted from weeks of intensive sailing and charting, had retired for the night. The helmsman, confident the sea was calm, handed the tiller over to a young ship's boy, a grave and fatal breach of maritime protocol. In the dead of night, while the crew slept, the flagship, the mighty Santa Maria, drifted silently onto a hidden coral reef. The scraping of the hull on the reef awoke Columbus. Despite frantic efforts, the ship was immovably wedged. The sea was mercifully calm, allowing the crew and most of the essential cargo to be saved. Guecanagari and his people acted with incredible speed and compassion. They used their canoes to ferry the salvaged goods, cannons, food, tools, and trade items, from the wreck to the shore, guarding the Europeans' possessions from theft. Columbus was deeply touched by this generosity, writing that they are a loving and uncovetous people, and I certify to your highnesses that there are no better people nor a better country in the world. The loss of the Santa Maria was a catastrophic blow. It meant that both remaining vessels, the Nina and the Pinta, still missing, would be overloaded for the return journey. Columbus now faced the agonizing choice of what to do with the approximately 40 men who could not possibly fit on a single remaining ship, the Nina. Founding La Navidad. Columbus turned the tragedy into a tactical opportunity. The lost flagship's timbers, along with its arms and supplies, provided the perfect material for building a temporary fort. On the north shore of Hispaniola, near the Taino village of Cacique Guecanagari, Columbus ordered the construction of a small fortification, a stockade and towers made from the salvaged Santa Maria wood. He named this first European settlement in the New World La Navidad, the Nativity, in honor of the day the shipwreck occurred. Columbus left 39 men behind, under the command of Diego de Arona, a trusted notary. Their mission was clear: establish trade with the natives, learn their language, and, most importantly, find the source of the gold before Columbus returned. He armed them with cannons and muskets, instructing them to maintain discipline and respect the natives, but also to instill a healthy fear of Spanish power. On January 4, 1493, after a tearful farewell, Columbus and his reduced crew aboard the Nina prepared to set sail for Spain. He had discovered new lands, met new people, and secured the first physical foothold for the Spanish crown. The return journey was perilous, but the promise of glory and wealth was now within reach. The stage was set for the perilous return voyage, which would determine whether the admiral of the ocean sea would be hailed as a hero or dismissed as a madman who had sailed too far. The Atlantic's fury and the admiral's triumph. On January 4, 1493, with the makeshift fort of La Navidad established and 39 men left behind on Hispaniola, Columbus gave the order to lift anchor. The single remaining ship, the nimble but small Nina, turned east. The return journey was not merely a reverse of the outward voyage. While the ships had enjoyed the steady, westerly trade winds on the way out, they now had to sail against them. To compensate, Columbus pushed the Nina north and then northeast into the latitude of the westerlies, the wind system that blows from America toward Europe. On January 6, 1493, a monumental piece of luck occurred. The Pinta, captained by the rebellious Martín Alonso Pinzón, reappeared. Pinzón, having spent weeks on an unauthorized gold hunting mission on the eastern end of Hispaniola, tried to brazenly rejoin the fleet, claiming he had been blown off course. Columbus, though secretly furious at the betrayal, understood the practical reality: he needed the Pinta. He accepted the flimsy excuse and commanded the two ships to sail in tandem. Their course now brought them into the turbulent, unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic in midwinter. The mid-ocean tempest. For a month, the sailing was swift and successful, but as they neared the Azores Islands in February, the weather turned savage. The sea began to display a hostility far beyond anything they had experienced on the outbound trip. On February 12, a massive hurricane-force storm struck the two caravels. The ships were buffeted by mountainous waves, and the wind shrieked through the rigging. The tiny vessels, designed for coastal trading, were completely outmatched. The psychological terror on board was immense. The crews believed they were doomed, and their great discovery would be lost to the depths. Pinzón and the Pinta, with its already weakened rigging, were completely separated from the Nina in the storm. Columbus was convinced the Pinta had sunk. Facing imminent disaster, Columbus prepared for the possibility that the Nina would be lost. He recorded one of his most desperate acts. He wrote a summary of his discovery on parchment, wrapped it in waxed cloth, sealed it within a wooden barrel, and threw it overboard, hoping the sea currents might carry the news of the New World to Europe, should he and his crew perish. He performed a similar act, placing a second barrel on the deck to be carried away if the ship foundered. The crew was equally desperate, offering a series of pious vows and pilgrimages to the Virgin Mary and to various shrines, praying for deliverance. The storm raged for days, relentless and violent. Forced landing, the Portuguese challenge. Miraculously, the Nina survived. Battered and leaking, the caravel was driven toward the Portuguese Azores Islands, making a forced, emergency landing at the island of Santa Maria on February 15. This was hostile territory. The islands belonged to Portugal, Spain's powerful maritime rival. Columbus's landing was met with suspicion and immediate conflict. The local Portuguese governor, João de Castanheira, attempted to detain Columbus and his men, arguing that the voyage violated the 1479 Treaty of Alcacovas, which designated which areas of the Atlantic belonged to Castile and which to Portugal. Columbus, standing on the deck of his battered ship, wrapped in the authority of his new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, refused to surrender. He threatened to destroy the port and take prisoners back to Spain. The governor eventually backed down, though some of Columbus's crew were briefly held, forcing Columbus to demonstrate his Spanish authority. After several weeks of tense delay, repairs, and recuperation, Columbus set sail again, only to be struck by another, even more ferocious storm. The Nina was swept perilously close to the coast of Portugal, its mast breaking and forcing a final, humiliating emergency landing in the mouth of the Tagus River, right at the capital city of Lisbon, on March 4, 1493. A diplomatic game in Lisbon. Columbus had sailed straight into the lion's den. Lisbon was the home of King John II, the very monarch who had dismissed Columbus's plan years earlier. The Portuguese court viewed the Spanish success with intense suspicion and anger. Columbus was immediately summoned to the royal palace at Vale do Paraíso. The meeting was a tense and historic confrontation. Columbus, now physically broken but emotionally triumphant, presented his claims. He had successfully reached the Indies by sailing west, thereby opening a new route and securing a great victory for the Spanish crown. He displayed his proof: the gold nuggets, the exotic parrots, and the astonished Taino captives whom he insisted were Indians. King John II listened carefully, but his response was chilling. He claimed that under the Treaty of Alcacovas, any lands discovered west of the Canary Islands belonged to Portugal. The implication was clear: the discovery belonged to Lisbon, not Castile. Some Portuguese courtiers even suggested the king should simply execute Columbus for trespass. However, King John II was cautious. He could not risk a war with Spain over an unsubstantiated claim, and Columbus's evidence was compelling. The king chose to play a diplomatic game, allowing Columbus to depart with a stern warning. For Pinzon, who had sailed separately and landed in Galicia, Spain, the ordeal was too much. He died just days after reaching his home port, possibly from exhaustion, sickness, or a broken spirit, avoiding the official judgment of the admiral. The hero's welcome. On March 15, 1493, the sole survivor of the three-ship fleet, the caravel Nina, finally dropped anchor back at the harbor of Palos de la Frontera, exactly 7.5 months after it had departed. The return was not merely a local event, it was a revelation. Word traveled like wildfire. The bells of Palos rang out, the town erupted in celebrations, and people poured in from the countryside. The humble Genos weaver's son had returned an admiral. Columbus's final, greatest performance took place in Barcelona, where the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, held their court. The procession into the city was a stunning spectacle. Columbus rode triumphantly on horseback, followed by his crew, and leading the way were the living trophies of his voyage, 6 surviving Taino captives, decorated with their gold ornaments, feathers, and body paint. They carried exotic artifacts, parrots of bright colors, foreign plants, and, most importantly, the tangible evidence of gold. The monarchs rose from their thrones as Columbus approached, an honor never before bestowed on a commoner. Columbus knelt to kiss their hands, but they graciously bade him rise and sit in their presence as he gave his full account. The admiral, now fully believing his own myth, spoke of islands teeming with wealth, of gentle, pliable people ready for conversion, and of a direct path to the riches of the Orient. The court was ecstatic. Columbus was immediately confirmed in all his titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor. He had secured his place in history and delivered an unprecedented triumph for Spain. The news of the discovery, first spread via Columbus's widely published letter to Sant'Angelo, raced across Europe, shocking every court and government. The race for the New World had officially begun. The second expedition, grandeur and purpose. Columbus's triumph in Barcelona in the spring of 1493 was immediate and overwhelming. The Spanish monarchs, energized by the display of gold and the fear of Portuguese encroachment, moved with astonishing speed to formalize and fund the second, vastly larger expedition. This would not be a voyage of exploration, it was a mission of colonization, exploitation, and conquest. On September 25, 1493, less than 7 months after his return, the Second Fleet departed Cadiz, marking the true beginning of the European settlement of the Americas. The scale was unprecedented. 17 ships, massive galleons and quick caravels, carried an estimated 1,200 to 1,500 men. This was not a crew of sailors, but a full cross-section of Spanish society, soldiers, farmers, priests, artisans, royal officials, and, crucially, landless nobles seeking quick wealth and glory. The fleet was a floating ark, carrying the old world with it. Packed below deck were horses, essential for conquest and transport, along with cattle, pigs, goats, seeds, and the cuttings of European crops, including sugar cane. This was the physical initiation of the Columbian exchange. The objectives were starkly clear, articulated in the royal instructions. Establish a permanent Spanish colony on Hispaniola. Convert the natives to Christianity and treat them well, a directive often repeated and immediately ignored. Find the source of the gold and establish a profitable trading post to repay the massive investment. Leading the vast fleet, Columbus was at the zenith of his power, now styling himself viceroy and governor of the new territories. He sailed a new, more southerly route, taking advantage of the favorable currents and winds. New lands, new realities. The crossing was swift. On November 3, 1493, the fleet made landfall on a majestic, mountainous island in the Lesser Antilles, which Columbus named Dominica, Sunday. For the next several weeks, they threaded through the Caribbean archipelago, discovering and naming dozens of islands, including Guadeloupe, Montserrat, Antigua, and the Virgin Islands, before finally arriving at Puerto Rico, rich port. In the process, they had their first significant encounters with the Carib people, whom the Taino had described as fierce cannibals. While the full extent of Carib cannibalism remains a subject of intense historical debate, the Spaniards found clear evidence of violence and observed human bones in their villages. These encounters, marked by resistance and bloodshed, solidified a narrative in the Spanish mind that justified the future enslavement of any indigenous groups deemed hostile. The admiral now steered toward his main objective, the colony of La Navidad on Hispaniola. The silence of La Navidad. On November 28, 1493, the massive Spanish fleet reached the bay near the site of the first settlement. As the ships anchored, the men, expecting the cheers of their countrymen, were met only by an ominous silence. Columbus ordered the firing of signal cannons, but no reply came from the shore. Landing parties found the fort of La Navidad burned to the ground. Cannons and weapons lay scattered, broken, or buried. There was no sign of the 39 men left behind. The local cacique, Guecanagari, Columbus's former ally, eventually appeared. He was wounded and provided a halting, tearful account, blaming a rival cacique, Cayanabo, who had supposedly attacked and destroyed the fort and killed the men. The true story, which gradually emerged from survivors' accounts and native reports, was far more brutal and complex. Freed from Columbus's authority, the garrison at La Navidad had immediately fallen into anarchy. Driven by greed, they had abandoned the fort, raping Taino women and stealing gold from the local villages. They split into factions, murdering each other over the spoils, and thus became easy targets for the increasingly hostile local tribes who had been abused. The lesson was delivered in ashes, the promise of a peaceful, resource-rich paradise was a chimera. The land Columbus claimed was not empty, it was inhabited, and the indigenous people were capable of fierce resistance. The founding of La Isabela and the turn to tyranny. Faced with the ruin of his first colony, Columbus was forced to move. He sailed eastward along the northern coast of Hispaniola and chose a new site, one he believed had access to the gold-bearing mountains of the interior. On January 2, 1494, he founded the permanent settlement of La Isabela, named for his patron Queen Isabella. La Isabela was planned to be a proper European town. Streets were laid out, a church was built, the site of the first Mass in the Americas, a storehouse was erected, and Columbus's own stone house was begun. But the colony was plagued from its first week. The site was poor, it lacked an adequate harbor and was situated near stagnant water, a breeding ground for mosquitoes. The colonists, mostly nobles and gentlemen unused to physical labor, quickly succumbed to European diseases, influenza, measles, smallpox, and the strenuous work of construction in a tropical climate. The expected torrent of gold failed to materialize. Disillusionment turned into open mutiny. The high-ranking royal official, Benoldo Pisa, led a conspiracy to seize several ships and return to Spain to report Columbus's failure to the crown. Columbus, desperate to maintain order, arrested de Pisa and the ringleaders, demonstrating a harsh, unyielding hand of governance. To placate the hungry, disgruntled settlers and to prove to the monarchs that his discovery was worthy, Columbus launched a brutal campaign. He sent the aggressive Captain Alonso de Ojeda into the interior, establishing a string of small forts to control the gold-producing region of Cibao. The Taino people were immediately subjected to a quota system. Every adult over the age of 14 was forced to provide a certain measure of gold every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off, a grotesque and bloody punishment. The Taino rebellion that followed was mercilessly crushed. Spanish soldiers on horseback, armed with superior steel and accompanied by ferocious attack dogs, proved devastatingly effective against the Taino's simple weapons. Columbus, now a governor grappling with insolvency, sent a fleet of 5 ships back to Spain in February 1495, not with the promised gold, but with the first significant cargo of human beings, 500 indigenous captives to be sold as slaves. This act, while welcomed by some in Spain, directly contravened the spirit of Isabella's instruction to treat the natives as loyal subjects, setting a grim precedent that would define the next century of colonization. The search for the Golden Paradise had devolved, in less than a year, into a campaign of disease, cruelty, and systematic forced labor. The dream was dead, the conquest had begun. The failure of governance and return to Spain. The massive investment of the second voyage yielded little return and much chaos. By 1496, the grand settlement of La Isabela was a dying failure. It was poorly sited, ravaged by disease, and home to a colony of disgruntled settlers whose dreams of easy gold had curdled into resentment and internal strife against the authoritarian rule of Columbus and his brothers, Bartolomé and Diego. The promised riches never materialized, and instead, the crown was met with endless demands for more supplies and soldiers. Columbus was a magnificent sea captain and explorer, but a disastrous administrator. His policies, especially the brutal enslavement and forced labor of the Taino, led to massive death tolls among the indigenous population and alienation among the Spanish settlers. In March 1496, Columbus departed Hispaniola, leaving his brother Bartolomé in charge. He arrived back in Cadiz, Spain, in June 1496, not to the exuberant welcome of his first return, but with a meager, sickly collection of gold and about 30 surviving Taino captives. He adopted the habit of a Franciscan friar, perhaps to emphasize his religious mission and deflect criticism. The monarchs, disappointed by the minimal economic returns, were hesitant. They allowed him to keep his titles but made it clear that a future voyage would be much smaller and contingent on improved results. They did, however, endorse the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which, on paper, neatly divided the unexplored world between Spain and Portugal, giving Spain exclusive claim to the new western lands. The third voyage, discovery of a continent. After 2 years of bureaucratic struggle, Columbus managed to secure funding for a third, smaller expedition of 6 ships. Its purpose was not just to resupply the faltering colony, but to explore the region south of the known islands. As Columbus hypothesized, there must be a massive landmass to counterbalance the known continents, or perhaps the edge of Asia he still sought. On May 30, 1498, Columbus sailed from Spain. Trinidad and the mainland, after a brutal crossing through the equatorial doldrums, a region of suffocating heat and no wind, Columbus changed course. On July 31, 1498, he sighted a new island, which he named Trinidad in honor of the Holy Trinity, having previously resolved to name his next discovery after the Triad. The Gulf of Paria, sailing past Trinidad, he entered the Gulf of Paria and observed an immense volume of fresh water pouring into the sea. This was the delta of the Orinoco River. Columbus, recognizing that such a colossal river could only flow from a continent, concluded he had discovered a huge, previously unknown landmass. In his deeply religious mind, he speculated that this was not merely a continent but the outer reaches of the earthly paradise or Garden of Eden. The Pearl Coast, his explorations led him along the coast of the mainland, present-day Venezuela, where he encountered people wearing magnificent pearls, leading to the Spanish name Pearl Coast. Columbus had, without knowing it, become the first European since the Vikings to sight the American mainland. Yet, in a testament to his stubborn conviction, he continued to cling to the belief that he had found a massive, southern peninsula of the Asian continent. Fall from grace, the governor arrested. Illness and failing eyesight soon forced Columbus to break off his exploration and sail directly to the new capital of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, which his brother Bartolomé had founded in 1496. He arrived on August 19, 1498, to a colony in complete anarchy. The colonists, desperate for wealth and furious over the Columbus brothers' tyrannical administration, were in open rebellion led by the settlement's Chief Justice, Francisco Roldan. Columbus, unable to put down the revolt, was forced to negotiate a humiliating peace, agreeing to grant the rebels back pay and large tracts of land. Reports of the chaos, incompetence, and the arbitrary brutality of the Columbus family, including the gruesome execution of Spanish colonists, had reached the court in Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, recognizing they had entrusted the vast enterprise to an inept governor, took decisive action. In August 1500, the royal commissioner Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo with absolute authority. His first sight was the bodies of 6 executed Spanish rebels still hanging from the gallows. Within days, Bobadilla conducted an investigation, found ample evidence of abuse and tyranny, and had Columbus and his brothers arrested. In a moment that sealed his downfall, Christopher Columbus, Viceroy of the Indies, was shipped back to Spain in iron chains. He refused to let the captain remove the shackles during the voyage, declaring he would wear them until the monarchs themselves ordered their release. Upon his dramatic arrival in Cadiz in October 1500, his appearance was a public humiliation. Ferdinand and Isabella were embarrassed by the spectacle and ordered his immediate release. They allowed him to keep his titles and wealth, but his authority was permanently stripped away. His 7-year term as governor was over, replaced by a royal appointee. Columbus's dream of a golden viceroyalty died on the decks of the ship that carried him home, chained like a common criminal. The fourth voyage, Search for the Strait, 1502 to 1504. Despite his public humiliation and the loss of his governing power, Christopher Columbus was a superb navigator. In 1502, now in his early 50s and suffering from a debilitating illness, likely a form of arthritis, the monarchs granted him one final, desperate voyage of discovery. His new mission was simple and crucial: find the strait that led through the new landmass and into the Indian Ocean, the route to Asia he had sought all along. He was expressly forbidden to stop at Hispaniola to avoid further conflict with the new governor, Nicolas de Ovando. Central America coast, Columbus, accompanied by his younger son Ferdinand, spent a year sailing the coasts of Central America, present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, probing every inlet for the passage. He became the first European to encounter the Mayan civilization's traders off the coast of Honduras, though he failed to follow them inland. Shipwreck, after months of storms, hostile encounters with natives, and the failure of his attempt to establish a new trading post, his 4 ships were battered and riddled with shipworm, termites. By June 1503, with his remaining 2 vessels unsalvageable, Columbus was forced to beach the rotting ships on the northern coast of Jamaica. Stranded in Jamaica, the lunar eclipse trick. Columbus and his crew were stranded in Jamaica for over a year. The local Taino people initially traded food for European trinkets, but relations soured as the castaways' demands increased and their supply of trade goods dwindled. The local chief eventually cut off their food supply, leaving the Spanish to face starvation. Desperate, Columbus devised a plan using his knowledge of astronomy. He consulted his almanac and noticed a total lunar eclipse was due on February 29, 1504. He gathered the Taino leaders and warned them that his Christian God was angry with them for refusing to feed his men and that, as a sign of God's wrath, the moon would disappear from the sky that very night. When the eclipse began as predicted, the sight of the moon turning blood red and slowly vanishing terrified the indigenous people, who rushed to the ships with provisions, begging Columbus to intercede with his God. Columbus retreated to his cabin, timing the event with an hourglass, and reappeared just as the eclipse's totality was ending, announcing that God had forgiven them and would restore the moon. The trick worked, and the Taino continued to supply the castaways until a rescue caravel finally arrived from Hispaniola in June 1504. The final years and death. Columbus finally returned to Spain on November 7, 1504, a broken and ailing man. He was received quietly. Queen Isabella, his chief patron, died just weeks later. The remainder of his life was spent in a frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful effort to recover his lost titles, especially the viceroyalty, and his promised share of the New World's profits. King Ferdinand politely listened but refused to restore his governing authority. Christopher Columbus died on May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain. He was around 54 years old. He likely succumbed to a chronic illness, described at the time as gout, but now believed by some medical historians to be writer's syndrome, reactive arthritis. To the end of his days, Columbus remained convinced that the lands he had explored were the eastern fringe of Asia, utterly unaware that he had opened up two entirely new continents to the Old World. For Voyages of Christopher Columbus to discover America is relevant because it discusses his final journey, including his explorations in Central America and the end of his career.